I was sitting in the breakfast nook of my childhood home, the morning sun filtering through the gauzy white curtains that my mother had hung there 23 years ago, when I noticed my sister Claire watching me with that peculiar intensity she'd developed over the past few months. The ceramic mug in my hands was still warm from the coffee I'd poured, and I could smell the familiar aroma of the French roast blend that Dad had always preferred, mixed with the faint scent of vanilla candles that Claire had been burning constantly since his funeral 6 weeks ago. The kitchen felt different now, somehow smaller and more oppressive than I remembered from our childhood. The same yellow walls that had once felt cheerful now seemed to press in on me, and the old oak table where we'd done homework and shared countless family dinners bore the weight of too many unspoken tensions. Claire was sitting across from me, her manicured fingers drumming against the table's surface in a rhythm that made my teeth ache. She was wearing one of those expensive blouses she'd started buying since Dad's death, crisp white cotton that probably cost more than I made in a week at the bookstore. "Sarah," she said, and her voice carried that artificially sweet tone she'd perfected during her years in pharmaceutical sales. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Henderson said yesterday." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. Dr. Henderson was the family physician who'd been treating Dad during his final illness, a kind man with gentle hands and wire-rimmed glasses who'd known our family for over a decade. But Claire had been seeing him privately lately, appointments she claimed were just routine checkups but that always seemed to leave her looking satisfied in a way that made my stomach churn. "What about it?" I asked, setting my mug down carefully. The clink of ceramic against wood seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet kitchen. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking and the familiar rumble of the garbage truck making its Thursday morning rounds, sounds that had once comforted me but now felt distant and somehow ominous. Claire leaned forward, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something expensive and cloying that she'd never worn when Dad was alive. Her blue eyes, so much like our father's, were fixed on mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. "He mentioned that grief can manifest in many different ways, Sarah. Sometimes people who are struggling might not even realize they need help." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. My hands began to tremble slightly, a reaction I tried to hide by wrapping them around the warm ceramic of my mug. "What are you trying to say, Claire?" She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her skin cool and dry against my suddenly clammy palms. The gesture might have looked comforting to an outside observer, but I could feel the calculating nature of her touch, the way her fingers pressed just a little too firmly against my knuckles. "I'm saying that I'm worried about you," she said, her voice dropping to that confidential whisper she used when she wanted to seem concerned. "The way you've been talking about Dad, the things you've been saying about his will, about the house. Dr. Henderson thinks you might be experiencing some kind of breakdown." My heart began to pound so hard I was sure she could hear it. The kitchen around us seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the air itself had become unstable. I could taste metal in my mouth, that sharp flavor of fear and adrenaline that I remembered from childhood nightmares. "I haven't been talking about Dad in any unusual way, Claire. And I certainly haven't said anything strange about his will." But even as I spoke the words, I could feel doubt creeping in around the edges of my certainty. Had I been talking too much about Dad's final days? About the way he'd seemed lucid right up until the end, about the things he'd whispered to me during those long nights when I'd sat by his hospital bed? About the lawyer he'd mentioned wanting to see, the one Claire had said was unavailable? "Sarah, honey," Claire continued, her thumb now stroking the back of my hand in what might have been a soothing gesture if not for the steel beneath her voice. "You told Mrs. Patterson next door that Dad was trying to communicate with you from beyond the grave. You called the probate office 3 times last week asking about documents that don't exist. Yesterday, you accused me of hiding Dad's real will." The words felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place, but not in the way Claire intended. I pulled my hand away from hers and stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a harsh sound that made us both wince. My pulse was racing now, and I could feel sweat beginning to form along my hairline despite the cool morning air drifting through the open window. "I never said Dad was communicating from beyond the grave," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I told Mrs. Patterson that I felt his presence in the house sometimes, which is completely normal for someone who's grieving. And I called the probate office because there were discrepancies in the paperwork you showed me." Claire's expression shifted subtly, the mask of concern slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. She stood as well, smoothing her blouse with those careful movements that had always annoyed me, even when we were children. She was taller than me by several inches, something she'd used to her advantage our entire lives, and she used that height now to look down at me with what she probably thought was compassionate authority. "The probate office has no record of any calls from you, Sarah," she said, and now her voice carried the crisp efficiency she used with difficult clients. "I checked with them myself yesterday. And Dr. Henderson is very concerned about these episodes you've been having." Episodes. The word hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I could feel the walls of the kitchen pressing closer, the familiar space suddenly transformed into something threatening and alien. The smell of coffee was making me nauseous now, and I could hear my own breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "What episodes?" I managed to ask, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. Claire moved around the table toward me, her steps careful and measured like someone approaching a dangerous animal. "The blackouts, Sarah. The times when you lose hours and don't remember where you've been or what you've done. The medications you've been taking that aren't prescribed to you." My vision went gray around the edges, and I had to grip the back of my chair to keep from falling. "Medications? What medications?" I felt like I was drowning in confusion, like someone had taken my life and scrambled all the pieces while I wasn't looking. The kitchen floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet, and I could taste bile rising in my throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered, but the words sounded weak even to my own ears. Claire was close enough now that I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the ones that had appeared over the past year as she dealt with Dad's illness and death. But there was something else in her expression, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Dr. Henderson found traces of benzodiazepines in your system during your physical last month," she said gently. "You don't have a prescription for those, Sarah. And you told him you didn't remember taking anything like that." The world tilted sideways, and I found myself sitting back down in the chair without remembering how I got there. My hands were shaking openly now, and I clasped them together in my lap to try to stop the trembling. The yellow walls of the kitchen seemed to be pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, and I could hear a rushing sound in my ears like distant water. "That's impossible," I said, but my voice sounded strange and distant, as if it was coming from someone else entirely. "I would remember taking medication." "Would you?" Claire asked, pulling her own chair closer to mine. "Would you remember, Sarah? Because you don't seem to remember a lot of things lately. Like the phone calls you made to Dad's lawyer at 2 in the morning. Or the time you spent 3 hours standing in his old office, talking to an empty chair." Each word felt like a physical blow, and I could feel myself fragmenting, pieces of my certainty crumbling away like old mortar. Had I done those things? The memory of standing in Dad's office was hazy, dreamlike, but it felt real in a way that made my skin crawl. I could almost smell the lingering scent of his cologne, the leather binding of his old books, the mustiness of papers that had sat too long in desk drawers. "Even if that's true," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "it doesn't mean I'm having a breakdown. People grieve differently, Claire. Just because I'm not handling Dad's death the same way you are doesn't mean there's something wrong with me." Claire reached out and touched my shoulder, her fingers cool through the cotton of my t-shirt. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, and now her voice was thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. "I wish that's all this was. But it's more than grief, Sarah. Dr. Henderson thinks you might be developing the same condition that affected Dad's sister. Aunt Margaret." The name hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, and suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. Aunt Margaret, who'd spent the last 15 years of her life in a psychiatric facility upstate, who'd been declared incompetent to manage her own affairs after she'd started seeing things that weren't there and making wild accusations about family members stealing from her. "That's not what this is," I said, but my voice cracked on the words. "Aunt Margaret was diagnosed with early-onset dementia. That's completely different from whatever you think is happening to me." "Is it?" Claire asked, and now she was kneeling beside my chair, her face level with mine. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and for a moment I almost believed in her concern. "Sarah, you've been exhibiting the same symptoms Margaret had in the beginning. The paranoia, the memory gaps, the medications that appear in your system with no explanation. Dr. Henderson thinks we need to act quickly, before things get worse." "Act quickly." The phrase sent ice water through my veins, and suddenly I was completely alert, every nerve ending in my body singing with danger.
What do you mean, act quickly?
Claire's hand moved to cover mine again, and this time I could feel the slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed her own nervousness. There's a facility about an hour north of here, she said carefully. A very nice place that specializes in helping people who are experiencing what you're going through. Dr. Henderson has already spoken with them, and they have a bed available. The kitchen around us seemed to contract further, until I felt like I was looking at Claire through the wrong end of a telescope. My hearing became hypersensitive, picking up every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock above the sink, the rustle of Claire's blouse as she shifted position. I could smell everything too intensely, her perfume, the lingering scent of breakfast, something metallic that might have been fear. "You want to have me committed," I said, and the words came out flat and emotionless, like I was reading them from a script. "I want to get you help," Claire corrected, but I could hear the rehearsed quality in her response.
"Sarah, you're not well."
"You haven't been well since Dad died, and it's getting worse.
Yesterday you called me at my office and accused me of poisoning you. You don't even remember doing it, do you?"
I stared at her, searching my memory for any trace of such a phone call, but found only gray fog where those hours should have been. The absence of memory was more terrifying than any nightmare, a blank space in my consciousness that seemed to mock my attempts to understand what was happening to me.
"No," I whispered. "I don't remember."
Claire's expression softened, and she reached up to brush a strand of hair away from my face. Her touch was gentle, almost motherly, but it made my skin crawl. "That's why we need to do this, honey. Before you hurt yourself, or hurt someone else."
"Hurt someone else?"
The implication hung in the air like smoke, and I could see the fear flickering in Claire's eyes despite her concerned expression. She was afraid of me, or at least she was very good at pretending to be. The thought should have horrified me, but instead I felt a strange detachment, as if I was watching this scene unfold from a great distance.
"What happens to the house?"
I asked suddenly, the question appearing in my mind fully formed.
"What happens to Dad's estate if I'm declared incompetent?"
Something shifted in Claire's face, so quickly I might have imagined it.
"That's not what this is about, Sarah." "But what happens?"
I pressed, and now I could hear strength returning to my voice.
"If I'm committed, if I'm declared unable to manage my own affairs, what happens to my inheritance?"
Claire stood up abruptly, turning away from me to face the kitchen window. The morning light caught the blonde highlights in her hair, making them gleam like spun gold. She was silent for a long moment, and in that silence I could hear the house settling around us, the familiar creaks and sighs that had been the soundtrack of our childhood. "The estate would need to be managed by someone the court deems responsible," she said finally, her back still turned to me.
"Someone who could make decisions in your best interest. Someone like you."
She turned back to face me, and now all pretense of gentle concern had dropped away. Her expression was hard, businesslike, the face she wore when she was closing a difficult sale.
"Someone like me, yes. But Sarah, that's not why I'm doing this."
"I'm doing this because I love you and I'm terrified that you're going to end up like Aunt Margaret." The mention of Aunt Margaret again made something click into place in my mind, a memory I'd forgotten until this moment. I was 12 years old, sitting at this same kitchen table, listening to my parents argue in the next room about Margaret's condition. I couldn't make out all the words, but I remembered the tone of my father's voice, angry and frustrated in a way I'd rarely heard before. And I remembered something else, Claire, who would have been 16 then, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, listening with an expression of intense concentration. "You were there," I said suddenly. "When Mom and Dad were fighting about Aunt Margaret.
You were listening."
Claire's face went very still.
"I don't know what you're talking about."
"Yes, you do." The memory was becoming clearer now, like a photograph slowly developing. Dad was angry because someone had been talking to the doctors about Margaret's condition, giving them information about her behavior that wasn't true. Someone in the family had been making her sound sicker than she really was.
"Sarah, you're not making sense."
But I was making sense, more sense than I had in weeks. The fog that had been clouding my thoughts was beginning to lift, and underneath it I could see the shape of something monstrous. Dad suspected that someone was manipulating the situation, making Margaret seem more unstable than she actually was. Someone who stood to benefit from her being declared incompetent. Claire was backing toward the kitchen door now, her composed mask finally beginning to crack.
"You're having another episode, Sarah. You're not thinking clearly."
"I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months," I said, standing up from the chair. My legs felt shaky but strong enough to support me.
"How long have you been drugging me, Claire?" The question hung in the air between us like a live wire, dangerous and electric.
Claire's face had gone pale, and I could see a pulse jumping in her throat. For a moment, she looked exactly like she had when we were children and she'd been caught in some elaborate lie. "That's a terrible accusation," she said, but her voice lacked conviction.
"Is it? Because suddenly everything makes sense.
The memory gaps, the medications in my system that I never took, the way you've been so eager to get me to see Dr. Henderson.
You've been setting this up for weeks, haven't you? Making me look unstable, creating a paper trail that shows I'm not competent to manage my own affairs."
Claire's hand moved to the kitchen door, gripping the frame like she needed the support.
"Sarah, please. You're scaring me."
"Good," I said, and I was surprised by the venom in my own voice. "You should be scared."
"Because I'm going to figure out exactly what you've done, and I'm going to prove it."
But even as I spoke the words, I could feel doubt creeping back in.
Was I being paranoid? Was this exactly the kind of wild accusation that someone having a mental breakdown would make?
The certainty I'd felt moments before began to waver, and I could see Claire noticing the change in my expression. "Honey," she said, her voice becoming gentle again.
"Listen to yourself. You're talking about conspiracy theories, about me drugging you and manipulating doctors. Does that really sound reasonable to you?" It didn't, that was the problem. It sounded exactly like something a paranoid, unstable person would believe. And maybe that's what I was becoming.
Maybe the grief and stress of losing Dad had finally pushed me over an edge I hadn't even realized I was approaching.
"I don't know,"
I admitted, sinking back into the chair.
"I don't know what's real anymore."
Claire was beside me again instantly, her arms wrapping around my shoulders in what felt like a genuine embrace. She smelled like expensive shampoo and that cloying perfume, but underneath it was something that reminded me of our childhood, of the times when she'd comforted me after nightmares or schoolyard bullies. "That's exactly why you need help," she whispered against my hair.
"You're confused and frightened, and you're seeing threats where there aren't any. But it's going to be okay, Sarah. I promise it's going to be okay."
I wanted to believe her. Part of me desperately wanted to sink into her embrace and let her take care of everything, the way she had when we were children and she was the big sister who always knew what to do. But something held me back, some instinct that told me to be careful, to not trust too completely. "The facility you mentioned," I said, pulling back to look at her face.
"Can I see some information about it before I agree to anything?"
Claire's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance before settling back into compassionate concern.
"Of course, honey.
I have some brochures in my purse."
"But Sarah, we really can't wait too long.
Dr. Henderson is very concerned about your current state, and the facility only has that one bed available." The pressure to decide quickly, the urgency Claire was projecting, it all felt wrong somehow. But I was so tired, so confused by the gaps in my memory and the medication that had appeared in my bloodstream with no explanation.
Maybe she was right. Maybe I did need help.
"Let me see the brochures," I said finally. Claire's face lit up with what looked like genuine relief, and she hurried out of the kitchen to retrieve her purse from the hall table. I sat alone in the sudden quiet, listening to the familiar sounds of the house around me. The refrigerator hummed, the old pipes knocked softly in the walls, and somewhere upstairs a board creaked as the house settled into the warming day. This was my childhood home, the place where I'd learned to walk and talk and read, where I'd cried over broken toys and celebrated birthdays and graduation. Dad had left it to both Claire and me in his will, along with a modest trust fund that would allow us to maintain it.
But if I was declared incompetent, my half would need to be managed by someone else. Someone like Claire.
The thought sent a chill through me, but before I could explore it further, Claire was back with a handful of glossy brochures. She spread them out on the kitchen table like she was dealing cards, each one showing pictures of peaceful gardens in comfortable rooms and smiling staff members in crisp uniforms. "Willowbrook Residential Treatment Center," she said, pointing to the largest brochure. "It's really beautiful, Sarah. They specialize in helping people who are dealing with grief-related mental health issues. Look at these gardens, you could spend hours walking the paths, getting some fresh air and peace." The brochures were impressive, I had to admit. The facility looked more like an expensive resort than a psychiatric hospital, with rolling lawns and well-appointed common areas and what appeared to be individual cottages for residents. But something about the images bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. "How much does it cost?" I asked. "Don't worry about that," Claire said quickly. "Your insurance will cover most of it, and I can help with the rest if necessary. The important thing is getting you the help you need." But I was worried about it. The facility in the brochures looked expensive, probably far more expensive than my insurance would cover. And if I was committed involuntarily, would I even have a say in how my money was spent? The questions multiplied in my mind, each one spawning two more, until I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty. "I want to talk to Dad's lawyer first," I said suddenly. Claire's hand, which had been reaching for one of the brochures, froze in midair. "Dad's lawyer?" "Mr. Peterson. I want to understand exactly what happens to my inheritance if I'm declared incompetent. I want to know what my rights are." "Sarah, Mr. Peterson is retired. I told you that weeks ago. The firm is handling Dad's estate now through their junior associates." But had she told me that? I searched my memory and found only more gray fog, more missing pieces that should have been there but weren't. The frustration of it made me want to scream, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Then I want to talk to whoever is handling the estate," I said. "Before I agree to anything, I want to understand the legal implications." Claire's expression was patient, but I could see tension building in the set of her shoulders. "Of course, honey. But remember what I said about the bed at Willowbrook only being available for a short time. We can't delay too long." The pressure again, the sense of urgency that felt manufactured. I looked down at the brochures spread across the table, at the pictures of smiling residents and caring staff, and suddenly I knew what had been bothering me about the images. They all looked too perfect, too staged. Like advertising photos rather than candid shots of real people receiving real treatment. "I need some time to think," I said, gathering the brochures into a neat stack. "This is a big decision, and I don't want to rush into anything." Claire's face went through several expressions in quick succession: disappointment, frustration, and something that might have been anger before settling back into concerned understanding. "Of course you need time to think," she said. "But Sarah, I'm worried about leaving you alone here. What if you have another episode? What if you hurt yourself?" The suggestion that I might hurt myself sent a new spike of fear through me. Was that a possibility? Had I done something to suggest I was suicidal? More questions with no answers, more pieces of my life that seemed to be missing. "I'm not going to hurt myself," I said, but the words sounded uncertain even to my own ears. "You might not mean to," Claire said gently. "But honey, you've been taking medications you don't remember taking. What if you accidentally take too many? What if you have another blackout while you're driving, or cooking, or using the upstairs bathroom where Dad fell that one time?" Each scenario she painted was plausible, terrifying in its reasonableness. And the fact that I couldn't remember taking any medications made it impossible to argue that I wouldn't do it again. I felt trapped, caught between my suspicions about Claire's motives and my genuine fear that she might be right about my condition. "What if I stayed with you for a few days?" I suggested. "At your apartment? That way you could keep an eye on me while I decide about Willowbrook." Claire was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind. "My apartment is so small," she said finally. "And I've been working such long hours trying to catch up after taking time off for Dad's funeral. I don't think I could give you the kind of attention you need." Another reasonable objection, but something about the way she delivered it felt rehearsed. As if she'd anticipated this suggestion and prepared her response in advance. The thought made my skin crawl, But I couldn't shake the feeling that this entire conversation had been scripted, at least on her end.
Then what do you suggest? I asked.
Claire reached across the table and took my hand again, her grip firm and warm. I think we should call Dr. Henderson and tell him you're ready to get help. I think we should drive up to Willowbrook this afternoon and get you checked in before anything else happens.
This afternoon.
The timeline was accelerating, and I felt like I was being swept along by a current I couldn't control. Everything in me screamed that this was wrong, that I was being manipulated, but the evidence of my own instability was too compelling to ignore. The medications in my bloodstream, the memory gaps, the phone calls I apparently didn't remember making, how could I trust my own judgment when my own mind seemed to be betraying me? I'm scared, I admitted, and the words came out small and vulnerable. Claire's expression softened, and for a moment she looked like the sister I'd grown up with, the one who taught me to tie my shoes and defended me from playground bullies.
I know you are, honey. But I'm going to take care of you, okay?
I'm going to make sure you get the help you need, and I'm going to be here for you every step of the way.
I wanted to believe her.
Despite all my suspicions and fears, part of me desperately wanted to trust that my sister had my best interests at heart. She was the only family I had left now that Dad was gone, the only person in the world who shared my childhood memories and understood the weight of our shared loss.
But something nagged at me, some detail that didn't fit with the picture she was painting.
And then it hit me, the timing of Dad's death, and the way Claire had handled the aftermath.
Claire, I said slowly, when Dad was in the hospital those last few days, you spent a lot of time talking to the doctors privately, didn't you?
She nodded, her expression still patient and caring.
Of course I did.
Someone had to coordinate his care, and you were so emotional that I thought it would be better if I handled the medical decisions. But Dad was still lucid then. He could have made his own decisions.
He was on a lot of pain medication, Sarah. He wasn't thinking clearly.
He seemed clear to me, I said, remembering those final conversations I'd had with my father. His voice had been weak, but his mind had seemed sharp. He'd talked about his regrets, his hopes for Claire and me, and his concerns about how we would manage after he was gone. And he'd mentioned wanting to see his lawyer, something about making sure his affairs were properly arranged. That's grief talking, Claire said, but I could hear an edge creeping into her voice.
You want to remember him as being more aware than he actually was.
It's natural, honey, but it's not realistic. He asked for Mr. Peterson, I said, the memory becoming clearer as I spoke. He said he needed to see his lawyer about something important.
But you told him Mr. Peterson was unavailable.
Claire's hand tightened on mine, her grip becoming almost painful.
Sarah, Dad was confused.
He'd been asking for people who had been dead for years. He asked for his mother, for his old business partner who died in the 1990s. The medication was making him hallucinate.
Had it been hallucinations?
I tried to remember those final days more clearly, but they were hazy with grief and exhaustion. I'd been sleeping in the hospital chair, eating nothing but vending machine food, running on adrenaline and desperation.
Maybe my memory wasn't reliable either. I want to call Mr. Peterson's office, I said finally.
I want to confirm that he's really retired. Claire released my hand and sat back in her chair, her expression cooling noticeably. Sarah, this obsession with Dad's lawyer is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that Dr.
Henderson is concerned about. Can't you see that? Maybe it was paranoid. Maybe I was grasping at straws, looking for conspiracies where there were none.
But something in Claire's reaction to my request, the way her whole demeanor had shifted when I mentioned Mr. Peterson, told me I was onto something important.
It's one phone call, I said. If he really is retired, if there's nothing suspicious about Dad's will, then I'll go to Willowbrook this afternoon. But I need to make that call first.
Claire stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone, setting it on the table between us.
Fine, she said. Call him. But Sarah, when you discover that everything I've told you is true, will you please accept that you need help?
I picked up the phone with trembling fingers and dialed information, asking for the number of Peterson, Weber, and Associates. The operator connected me, and after a few rings, a receptionist answered with a professionally cheerful voice. "Peterson, Weber, and Associates, how may I help you?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Peterson, please," I said, my heart pounding so hard I was sure Claire could hear it. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Peterson is in court this morning." "Can I take a message, or would you like to speak with one of his associates?" "In court. Not retired, not unavailable, but in court." I felt the blood drain from my face as the implication hit me. Claire had been lying about Mr. Peterson being retired, which meant she'd probably been lying about other things too. "No message," I managed to say. "I'll call back later." I hung up and set the phone carefully on the table, my hands shaking so badly I could barely maintain my grip. Claire was watching me intently, and I could see that she knew what I'd discovered. "He's not retired," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah. He's not retired, Claire. He's in court this morning." "Which means he was available when Dad wanted to see him." "Which means you lied." Claire's mask finally slipped completely, and I could see the calculation in her eyes as she tried to decide how to handle this development. When she spoke, her voice was no longer gentle or concerned, but businesslike and cold. "You're right," she said. "I did lie about Mr. Peterson being retired. But I had a good reason." The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though part of me had been expecting it. "What reason?" "Dad wanted to change his will," Claire said, and now she sounded almost clinical, like she was discussing a business transaction. "He'd gotten some crazy idea about leaving everything to charity, about how Claire and I were both successful enough that we didn't need his money." "I couldn't let him do that, Sarah. Not when you're clearly not stable enough to manage your own finances." The room around me seemed to tilt and spin, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling out of my chair. "So you prevented him from seeing his lawyer?" "I protected both of us," Claire corrected. "If Dad had changed his will the way he wanted to, you'd have nothing right now. No house, no trust fund, no safety net. And given your current mental state, that would have been disastrous." "My current mental state that you created," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "You've been drugging me, haven't you? Slipping something into my food or drink to make me confused and forgetful." Claire laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Oh, Sarah. Even now, even when you're starting to figure things out, you're still not thinking clearly. Do you really think I've been sneaking around your house at night, putting pills in your coffee? Then how?" "The grief counseling sessions Dr. Henderson recommended," she said. "The ones you've been going to for the past month. The therapist there has been very helpful in managing your medication needs." "Dr. Reeves." I could suddenly picture her clearly, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a soothing voice who'd been helping me process my feelings about Dad's death. She'd given me pills to help with anxiety, to help me sleep, to help with the crushing weight of grief that had been making it hard to function. "Dr. Reeves has been drugging me?" "Dr. Reeves has been treating you," Claire corrected. "With my input, yes. Because you weren't thinking rationally, Sarah. You were obsessing over Dad's will, making wild accusations, behaving in ways that were clearly unhealthy. Someone had to take responsibility for your care." I thought back to those therapy sessions, trying to remember what medications Dr. Reeves had prescribed. But the memories were hazy, filtered through the fog that had been clouding my thoughts for weeks. Had she really been giving me benzodiazepines? Had I agreed to take them, or had they been administered without my knowledge? "You can't do this," I said, but my voice sounded weak and uncertain. "You can't just decide that I'm incompetent and take over my life." "I'm not taking over your life," Claire said patiently. "I'm getting you the help you need. And honestly, Sarah, after this conversation, I think it's clear that we can't wait any longer. You're becoming paranoid, making accusations against people who are trying to help you. That's exactly the kind of behavior that indicates you need immediate intervention." She was twisting everything, making my legitimate concerns sound like symptoms of mental illness. And the terrifying thing was that she was probably right about how it would look to outside observers. A woman grieving her father's death, exhibiting paranoid behavior, making wild accusations against her sister and her doctors. It was textbook mental breakdown material.
What about my inheritance? I asked. What happens to my half of Dad's estate if I'm committed? Claire's expression became genuinely sad, almost pitying.
Sarah, there is no inheritance.
Not for you. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. What do you mean?
Dad's will was very clear, she said gently. He left everything to me, with instructions that I should use the money to ensure you receive proper care for your mental health issues. He'd been concerned about your stability for months before he died, Sarah.
He knew you'd need someone to look after you.
That's not true, I whispered, but even as I said it, I could feel doubt creeping in.
Had Dad been concerned about me? Had I been showing signs of instability even before his death?
I have the will right here, Claire said, reaching into her purse again.
She pulled out a folded document and spread it on the table.
You can read it yourself. The paper was thick and official-looking, with Dad's signature at the bottom and the seal of his lawyer's office. But as I read through the dense legal language, my heart sank. Everything Claire had said was true: the house, the trust fund, everything was left to her, with only a brief mention of ensuring that I received appropriate medical care. "This isn't the will I saw before," I said desperately. "Before the funeral, you showed me a different document. One that left everything to both of us equally." Claire shook her head sadly. "Sarah, I never showed you any such document. That's another one of your false memories, like the phone calls you don't remember making and the medications you don't remember taking."
Was it a false memory?
I tried to recall that first meeting with the lawyer after Dad's death, but the details were frustratingly vague. I remembered sitting in a wood-paneled office, listening to someone read legal language, feeling numb with grief. But had the will really divided the estate between Claire and me, or was that just what I'd wanted to hear? "I don't understand," I said, staring down at the document. "Why would Dad do this? We had a good relationship. He never said anything about being concerned about my mental health." "Because he loved you too much to hurt you with his concerns," Claire said, reaching across the table to squeeze my shoulder. "But he talked to me about it, Sarah. He'd noticed the same things I've been seeing: the forgetfulness, the mood swings, the way you sometimes seem to be living in your own reality. He was worried that you might be developing the same condition that affected Aunt Margaret."
Aunt Margaret again.
The comparison felt like a knife twisting in my chest, because I could see the similarities Claire was drawing. The paranoid accusations, the insistence that family members were plotting against me, the confusion about what was real and what wasn't.
"So what happens now?"
I asked, my voice hollow with defeat. "Now we get you help," Claire said, and her voice was gentle again, almost loving. "We drive up to Willowbrook, and we get you checked in, and we start the process of getting you healthy again. And Sarah, I want you to know that I'll visit you every week. I'll make sure you have everything you need. This isn't about abandoning you, it's about getting you the care that Dad wanted you to have." I stared at the will spread out on the kitchen table, at the legal proof that everything I'd believed about my future was wrong. The house I'd grown up in, the financial security I'd thought would allow me to grieve in peace, the independence I'd taken for granted, all of it was gone, swept away by a document that reduced me to a charity case in need of supervision. "I need to pack some things," I said finally, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. Claire's face lit up with relief and what looked like genuine affection. "Of course, honey. Take your time. I'll call Willowbrook and let them know we're coming." I stood up from the table on unsteady legs, my entire world reorganizing itself around this new reality. As I walked toward the stairs, I could hear Claire behind me, already on the phone with someone, her voice professionally cheerful as she made arrangements for my admission. But as I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, something nagged at me about the will I'd just read. Something about the language, or the formatting, or the way Dad's signature looked. I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me, but there was something not quite right about the document. In my room, I pulled out the small suitcase I'd used for weekend trips and began mechanically folding clothes into it. T-shirts, jeans, underwear, pajamas, the basic necessities of a life that was about to be indefinitely interrupted. The familiarity of the task was almost comforting, giving my hands something to do while my mind struggled to process what had just happened. As I packed, I found myself looking around the room that had been my sanctuary for most of my life. The same pale yellow walls I'd chosen when I was 12, the same wooden desk where I'd done homework and written teenage poetry, the same window that looked out over the backyard where Claire and I had played as children. It felt like I was saying goodbye to more than just a room. I was saying goodbye to the person I'd been, the life I'd thought I was going to have. But as I reached for my jewelry box on the dresser, my fingers brushed against something I'd forgotten was there, a small digital recorder that Dad had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. I'd used it sometimes to record thoughts or ideas, but I hadn't touched it in months. Now, looking at it, an idea began to form. If Claire had been manipulating the situation, if she'd been lying about Dad's will and my mental state, then there might be evidence. And if I was really having the kind of mental breakdown she described, then having a record of my thoughts and experiences might help me understand what was happening to me. I slipped the recorder into my pocket and continued packing, but now my mind was racing with possibilities. Whatever was happening to me, whatever was real and what wasn't, I needed to start documenting everything. Because if I couldn't trust my own memories, then I needed another way to keep track of the truth. From downstairs, I could hear Claire's voice, still on the phone with someone. She was using her professional tone, the one she employed when she needed to convince someone of something important. But I couldn't make out the words, and I found myself straining to listen, wondering what arrangements she was making and with whom. As I zipped up my suitcase, I caught sight of myself in the dresser mirror. I looked terrible, pale and thin, with dark circles under my eyes and hair that hadn't been properly styled in weeks. The reflection looked like someone who might indeed be having a mental breakdown, someone who might need professional help to function. But it also looked like someone who had been systematically undermined and manipulated, someone who had been isolated and confused until she couldn't trust her own perceptions. The question was, which interpretation was correct? I picked up my suitcase and took one last look around the room. Tomorrow, someone else would be sleeping in this bed, making decisions about my life, controlling my future. The thought made me want to cry, but I found that the tears wouldn't come. Maybe that was another symptom of whatever was wrong with me, the inability to properly process emotion. Or maybe it was a sign that some part of me, some deep instinct, wasn't ready to give up yet. As I walked back downstairs, I could hear Claire finishing her phone conversation. She sounded pleased, satisfied in a way that made my stomach clench with renewed suspicion. But when she saw me, her expression immediately shifted back to concerned compassion. "All set?" she asked, reaching for my suitcase. "I've confirmed your bed at Willowbrook, and Dr. Henderson is going to meet us there to handle the admission paperwork." Dr. Henderson would be there. The family physician who had found benzodiazepines in my system, who had been consulting with Claire about my mental state. Another piece of the puzzle that seemed to fit too neatly into place. "I'm ready," I said, though the words felt like a lie. Claire smiled and gave me a quick hug, her embrace feeling both genuine and calculated. "You're doing the right thing, Sarah. Dad would be so proud of you for getting help." Would he? I tried to imagine what my father would think of this situation, but I couldn't seem to conjure his voice or his opinion. The grief had made so many of my memories of him feel distant and unreachable, like looking at him through frosted glass. We walked out to Claire's car, a sleek sedan that was much newer and more expensive than anything Dad had ever owned. She'd gotten it just a few months ago, she'd mentioned, a reward to herself for a particularly successful sales quarter. But looking at it now, I wondered where the money had really come from. The drive to Willowbrook took us through rolling countryside that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Claire kept up a steady stream of cheerful conversation, pointing out landmarks and talking about the changing seasons as if we were heading out for a pleasant day trip rather than to a psychiatric facility. I found myself tuning out her voice, focusing instead on the weight of the digital recorder in my pocket. Whatever happened next, I was going to document it. If I really was having a breakdown, then having a record might help me understand the progression of my illness. And if Claire was manipulating the situation, then maybe I could gather evidence that would prove it. The facility, when we finally arrived, looked exactly like the brochures had promised. Rolling lawns, mature trees, buildings that looked more like a college campus than a hospital. There were people walking the grounds who looked relaxed and comfortable, and the staff members we passed were smiling and friendly. But as we walked through the front doors, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was it, the moment when I would officially become a patient, when my autonomy would be handed over to others who claimed to know what was best for me. Dr. Henderson was waiting for us in the admissions office, his familiar face a small comfort in the sea of unfamiliar surroundings. He greeted me warmly, asking how I was feeling and expressing confidence that this was the right decision for my recovery. But there was something in his manner that felt rehearsed, as if this meeting had been planned in detail beforehand. The paperwork took nearly an hour, form after form that signed away various rights and responsibilities. I read each document carefully, looking for any red flags or unusual language, but everything seemed standard. Medical consent forms, financial agreements, emergency contact information, all the mundane details of institutionalization. But when it came to the financial arrangements, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The costs were indeed substantial, far more than my insurance would cover. And according to the paperwork, the additional expenses would be covered by something called the Sarah Mitchell Trust, with Claire listed as the trustee. What is this trust? I asked, pointing to the relevant section. Claire and Dr. Henderson exchanged a quick glance before Claire answered. It's something Dad set up before he died, she said. A fund specifically designated to cover your medical expenses. He wanted to make sure you'd always have access to the best possible care. Another piece of Dad's supposed planning that I had no memory of him mentioning. But the trust was referenced in official documents, signed and notarized, looking entirely legitimate. If it was a fabrication, it was an extremely sophisticated one. As I signed the final form, my hand trembling slightly, I felt like I was signing away the last remnants of my old life. The person who walked out of this office would be different from the one who walked in, a patient, a case study, someone whose thoughts and feelings and perceptions were officially suspect. But as Claire hugged me goodbye and promised to visit soon, I managed to activate the digital recorder in my pocket without anyone noticing. Whatever happened next, whatever was real and what wasn't, I would have a record. And maybe, eventually, that record would help me find my way back to the truth.